Hello, and welcome to Christian Faith and OCD with Carrie. I'm a Christ follower, wife and mother, licensed professional counselor who helps Christians struggling with OCD get to a deeper level of healing. When I couldn't find resources for my clients with OCD, God called me to bring this podcast to you with practical tools for developing greater peace. We're here to bust through the shame and stigma surrounding struggling with OCD as a Christian, sharing hopeful stories of healing and helping you replace uncertainty with faith. I'm here to help you let go of the past and future to walk in the present abundant life God has for you. So let's dive right into today's episode. Welcome to Christian Faith and OCD. Some of you are wondering, did I hear that right? Yes, you did. Today is the day we are starting the process of going from Hope for Anxiety and OCD to Christian Faith and OCD. I've been alluding to rebranding for quite some time, and I wanted to tell you the story of how this process came about. I have been hosting Hope for Anxiety and OCD since the fall of 2020, and it's been about 3.5 years now. So many good things have happened. I've had Christians write to me expressing thanks that they were no longer afraid or ashamed to take medication, which is incredible. Several people wrote saying, hey, I thought I had anxiety, but I listened to your show. I started listening to the personal stories of OCD and realized, hey, I think that's me. I have OCD. And of course, that was life-changing for them to have that knowledge. I've been able to meet people, see people for counseling that might not have found me otherwise across Tennessee had it not been for the podcast. I've even had people travel from out of state to do counseling retreats with me, which I talked about on a previous episode. That's been amazing. But earlier this year, I noticed that our downloads were declining. And I thought, okay, we're really only producing an episode every other week. I realized that's a slow pace. I did that because of having my daughter, being pregnant, going through the process of having an infant. If you've been there, you know it's a lot, okay? I took a little bit of a step back for the last couple years while my daughter was growing up and recognized this is a good time to go ahead and start putting out an episode every week. So we started doing that a few months ago. What I didn't know about the download decline was that it wasn't just about people getting lost or kind of dwindling away from listening to the show. It had to do with an Apple update where if you were subscribed to podcasts and Apples, they would download for you. People's phones were filling up. They didn't like that feature, and Apple decided to scrap that with a iOS 17 update. Things are no longer auto download. What that means in the podcasting world is that we had a lot of false downloads. We were looking at statistics where maybe a bunch of episodes were downloaded, but people weren't really listening or people weren't really necessarily following. So now all of our download numbers are a more accurate picture of who's actually initiating that download and listening to the show. As I was going through this process, recognizing okay, things had been going up and up and up for a while, and then things had kind of leveled off and then they were going down. I prayed this prayer of desperation to God in late February saying, I don't know what I'm doing. I've had this podcast for a long time, over 3 years. And I just need help. I need to know, okay, God, what is my next step? What am I really doing here? And it was one of those pivotal moments where you're like, okay, I've got to either keep doing this or I've got to stop. It just felt almost like there was no other option. Are we going to keep going? Can I still do this? And I said, okay, God, if you want me to do this, you are going to have to send me some help to know how to make this podcast better and to grow this show. And I was in the process, my husband and I were thinking about getting ready to move. I was listening to this organizational podcast. It was just organizing your house, different areas of your house. I thought, well, this will be really great for me as I'm decluttering. I'm getting ready to move. I'm thinking about how I'm going to want my house to be more organized when we move. That was a big push for me. listen to this podcast, and she says something about her friend who's a Christian podcast coach. And I was like, what? Wait, like it was one of those moments where you said, did she just say that? Like rewound for a few seconds. And I was like, oh, okay. I wrote down the lady's name, and God's timing was so specific. She was just getting ready to launch her coaching program again. For a 6-month coaching program. I looked it all up online and I said, okay, God, this is kind of expensive, but if you want me to do this, then you're going to have to provide the money because right now it's not in the account. And lo and behold, I received some money that I was not expecting. God brought the money in to the business. I was able to buy the program and started really making some changes and revamping in that process. I talked to Steve about it. I said, what should I do? Is this okay to spend this money on this? What do you think? And he's always been just incredibly supportive. And I said, go for it. I think that this is what you need to do. God lined all of these different things up for you after you reached this breaking point and prayed about it. So here we are. And I started to look at the podcast with completely new eyes. What were the episodes that you guys were listening to? What was getting downloaded the most? And it just came down to the OCD episodes was a short answer. Especially any personal stories related to OCD are probably our most popular episodes, other than obviously a lot of people listen to the first episode to see, hey, what's this whole podcast thing about? Putting Christian in the title was very strategic because when you have a podcast called Hope for Anxiety and OCD, unfortunately, you get a lot of people contacting you, not realizing it's a Christian podcast, maybe tuning in, not realizing, hey, we do talk about God and spiritual issues on the show. And unfortunately, we get a lot of what I call woo-woo requests, people that are like metaphysics, crystals, and some other stuff that I'm like, I don't think so. That's not really what we do over here. Putting Christian in the title was very strategic for me. Focusing more on OCD was obviously very strategic just in looking at the resources that you guys are looking for. I never would have started an OCD podcast 3.5 years ago for a few different reasons. One, there's a little bit of an imposter syndrome being in this space, speaking to these issues and not having lived experience with OCD. I would say the majority of people that I meet who treat OCD also have OCD. I know that that's not always the case, but typically in cases of things like addictions, eating disorders, OCD, like very specialized areas, a lot of times people have some type of lived experience. Either they've lived it or someone in their family has lived it. So for me, there is a little bit of an imposter syndrome saying I'm out here treating OCD and I haven't had that specific experience. I think that there are pieces of it that feel very relatable to me. The anxiety feels relatable because I've definitely had my fair share of anxiety in my life. The catastrophic thinking feels relatable. Perfectionism, I can definitely relate to. I am a recovering perfectionist. I don't consider myself a perfectionist now. That's something that the Lord has really worked with me on. It took a period of many years and lots of mistakes and lots of learning to be comfortable with not always doing things right. But praise the Lord, I'm not there where I was before. So there are different pieces that I can consider that I can relate to, but I don't have the lived experience that a lot of you guys have. It was interesting because I talked with one of our recent guests that I did a personal story with about this, Crystal Probst, and she said, it's okay because one of her therapists that had a lived experience with OCD, she felt like understood her less than the therapist she saw that didn't have the lived experience. And that was partially due to maybe different themes and different understandings that she felt like that person had. The other reason I wouldn't have started a podcast having to do with OCD 3 years ago is because I didn't have a large client basis at the time that I started the podcast of OCD clients. Now that has shifted a lot since starting the podcast. I've been able to work with more clients with OCD, more clients that had a higher level of severity. And I realized that there's a lot more help out there in general for Christians with anxiety than with OCD. And in the process of seeing more and more clients with OCD, it's caused me to dig in a lot deeper, gain even more knowledge. more training, more consultation with other counselors. I'm constantly learning new things and I'm constantly being challenged, but I enjoy that a lot. I think this intersection of Christian faith and OCD is so important because many people with scrupulosity feel like they're dealing with a spiritual issue when actually what they're dealing with is OCD. So if they feel like they're dealing with a spiritual issue, they don't want to take that to someone who is not well versed in Christianity or doesn't know the Bible. I also know there are significant struggles for Christians who are looking at exposure and response prevention therapy. Sometimes this therapy is not faith-informed. Some people do a really great job of being faith-informed and really knowing how to do sensitive exposures based on a person's faith. There are therapists that aren't Christian who are willing to work with your pastor or talk about what are the teachings, are any of these exposures going against your belief system or would be inappropriate or disrespectful. However, there are some other people out there that are potentially going kind of rogue. I hate to say negative things about therapists, but it's just like any other field. There are some good ones and there are some not so good ones. Unfortunately, it's hard sometimes for Christians to find helpful, appropriate OCD therapy where they feel like this person that they're receiving help from has a strong spiritual background as well as a strong clinical background. I know that it can be challenging for clients in ERP to write imaginal exposures, writing things that are not true about God and having to read those over or sit with them. I had a secular provider tell me that she's recommended clients not pray for a time period. Someone else told me recently that they had heard about exposure of reading the Satanic Bible, which I don't see as a religiously sensitive exposure. So these different types of things are coming up. And I don't say that to scare anybody away from ERP. There are some qualified, healthy ERP trained therapists. We've had them on the show before. We've also had people on the show with personal stories who've received ERP and have had good experience. Unfortunately, it's just a mixed bag out there. And some ERP therapists are not trauma informed. That's unfortunate since trauma exacerbates OCD symptoms and 25% of people who are diagnosed with OCD also qualify for post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. That's a good chunk. That's a quarter of people diagnosed with OCD. So trauma is something that has to be taken into consideration. This is one of the reasons that I have really latched on to ICBT therapy, inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. For me, having a background in treating trauma, this is a much more trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed therapy treatment for OCD. One thing that's shifted with the show, if you've noticed and been listening over the last few months, is that this started out being primarily an interview show. And I do love interviewing people. I am going to have more guests on, but I am transitioning this to a majority solo episode show with some guests sprinkled in who've had lived experience with OCD or professional tidbits to share with you guys. And through this process of reworking the podcast, God has shown me that He wants me to share with you the knowledge that I've learned and to use my voice to speak into the issues that you are all facing. I hear different things all the time, whether it's from clients that I have or people writing to me or people that I'm participating in learning sessions with. And there's so much that I want to share with you. And I want this show to be more practical tips. For a lot of times we've had a variety of different information. And it's a little bit been all over the place. Some people I'm sure have enjoyed that. So our tagline is practical strategies to greater peace, because I want you to walk away with practical tools and guidance that you can get to have a healthier relationship with your OCD. Ultimately, I would love for everyone listening to this to be healed. But I also know that just like some people have chronic health conditions, some people have chronic mental health conditions. That doesn't make you less of a Christian. It is not your fault if you are struggling with OCD. But if we can't get rid of something, sometimes we can have a different relationship with it. I've seen this in my own life in terms of dealing with some back pain that I've had to deal with off and on for the last several years, tailbone pain. And I have seen this in the life of my husband, who has SCA, which is a neurological disorder. He's an incredible testimony that God can still use you, even with your limitations. He's actually in Guatemala as this episode is coming out, and he's ministering to children and teens there. I'm definitely so proud of him for that. Now, I want to speak with some of you who are struggling with this change. Maybe you're dealing with anxiety and you're disappointed that I am focusing in on OCD. I see you. I also know that some of this information, not all of it, but some of it is still going to apply to you. There are some of you with anxiety that are still Googling too much. There are some of you with anxiety that are still dealing with whether you should take medication or not. There's some of you with anxiety that are catastrophizing and coming up with all kinds of worst case scenarios. And so while we might address that a little bit differently in terms of treating anxiety versus treating OCD, some of the information is still going to be relevant to you. And if you want to hang around and listen to it, you're certainly still welcome to. I see this podcast as a ministry, and God has definitely blessed me by allowing me to be a part of what is now a worldwide ministry. I would have never imagined that I would be the host of something that's going out into all of the world. I did not see that coming at all, but I feel so thankful to each one of you who listen. I know that we have a cohort of people that download our episodes week after week after week. So thankful for all of you. Even if you just pop in and listen a little bit here and there, I am thankful for you. And know that if you do reach out and send emails and talk to us or communicate with us, I do read all of our emails. I look forward to what God is going to do in the future in and through this podcast platform. Please join me on August the 5th for a free webinar, the Freedom from Mental Compulsions Challenge, where I'll be talking with you more about how ICBT can be helpful specifically for mental compulsions, although certainly it works for physical compulsions as well. I'm going to be giving away some free coaching sessions, so I'm excited to be doing that. The goal is for us to have fun and learn together. To sign up for the webinar, go to hopeforanxietyandocd.com/challenge. That is one thing I forgot to tell you. Our updated website is in process. Right now, we are working on getting everything switched over to carriebach.com. That's a funny story within itself, because I always thought that people who had their own domain name thought a little too highly of themselves and probably swore I'd never do it. But it just makes most sense for people who are looking for me for counseling services or for the podcast. So it's not live yet, but you will know when it's live if you sign up for our webinar or you get on our email list, hopeforanxiety.com/challenge. See you there. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you. Were you blessed by today's episode? If so, I'd really appreciate it if you would go over to your iTunes account or Apple Podcasts app on your computer if you're an Android person and leave us a review. This really helps other Christians who are struggling with OCD be able to find our show. Christian Faith and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be a substitute for seeking mental health treatment in your area.